Hello, I'm Andrew Vine, and this is Café Insights. I'm the founder and CEO of the Insight Bureau, an agency representing top-level professional speakers. And today, it's my pleasure to be in conversation with Dr. Andrew Staples from the Economist Group. Andrew, how are you doing?
Very good, thanks, Andrew. Good to see you again.
Yeah, well, actually, I have to confess, these Café Insights I used to do on a very regular basis, and the last one I did was back in February 2020. And who did I do that with? You. Right here in the Fullerton Hotel in Singapore.
I do recall.
So now that I've started these back again, I thought no better person to bring back and to kind of reflect on what has happened over these last 3 years, have a view on what is in store for us as we get into 2023. So within the Economist Group, Andrew, you work in a division called Economist Impact. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about the work you do in that area?
Yeah, that's right. So actually one of the big changes, last time we were talking, I was the Global Editorial Director of the Economist Corporate Network.
That's right.
One of the changes that's taken place, I'm now the head for a policy and insights team at Economist Impact. And Economist Impact itself is a new part of the Economist Group, which really brings together various capabilities and experiences, deliver on custom research essentially. So we are looking at some of the big issues that face the world around sustainability, around healthcare, around what we term new globalization. And the policy and insights team is the engine of that business. We conduct the research, we develop the content that goes with it, but then we use all of the channels of the Economist Group to get that message out in order to have an impact. We describe ourselves as having all of the rigor of a think tank combined with the capabilities of a global media brand.
Great. And of course, the area we tend to work in together is where we're giving advice to senior executives in their planning strategy, their board level meetings. And there's been a lot on their minds. We had the disruption of the COVID period, and I was wondering how you've been able to interpret, the kind of shifts that you've seen in the business landscape, what senior executives have had to grapple with in the last 3 years since we've had the shock to the system.
It's a really fascinating period to go through. Corporate network, as you know, is all about helping those senior executives understand what's going on in the world. So, looking at geopolitics, the future of work, and so on. When COVID hit and we realized it was something that was here to stay, we had to pivot that business towards really addressing the needs of that senior executive group. How do you lead through a crisis? How can you learn from a crisis? What do you need to know here and now? So that was some of the learning that we went through and had big implications for our business model. And maybe that's a sort of micro case study of I think what's happened around the world for many business leaders. They've had to look fundamentally at their business model. How are they set up? And how are they set up for the future that's evolving in front of us? Of course, we saw all of that reaction to COVID and all the challenges that people had dealing with that around the world. But underlying, we saw this, what we termed tech acceleration, this doubling down on investment in technology, which really then came to the fore when we start thinking about the future of work and how people are engaging with their employers and their clients and so on. So that's, I guess, one of the bigger things that we've seen. More recently, of course, 2022, we saw some big geopolitical shocks, not least Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine and everything that flowed from that in terms of the energy crisis, in terms of cost of living crisis, inflation rearing its head, and the responses from central banks around the world, not least in America, which led to that strengthening of the US dollar throughout 2022. Geopolitics, I think, has come back on to the top of the agenda again, and of course that key relationship between China and the United States, very much still in the deep freezer. We've been hearing a lot about what that means to the global economy in terms of decoupling, and further on from that, I guess, following on from that, thinking about what this means for globalization itself.
Yes, I was going to ask you, there's a lot of implications for global supply chains.
Yeah.
And people even going so far as to say that globalization is dead. But I think that's not quite correct, is it?
No, I think that's very much overplayed. Globalization has been around for a long time, and in fact, if you go back to sort of World War I, you could say that the global economy was far more integrated at that point on some measures. What's happening is globalization is changing. And this is actually nothing new. If you go back to the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008, if you look at trade and investment, some of those key measures of globalization, they've been pretty flat, if not stagnant, in that whole period up until recently. And then Then we had that whole shock of COVID and the quite rapid rebound in some parts of the world, although, of course, here in Asia, we're still waiting for that to fully unfold with China opening up. However, on different measures of globalization, particularly around services, the flows of digital trade, of intellectual property, of people and ideas, globalization is in very rude health. So it's a new form of globalization that we're coming to. We're also in a much more sort of contested international political economy. That sort of unipolar period that we had, particularly from the end of the Cold War up until the early 2000s, is in the rear-view mirror now. We are in something of a multipolar world with huge, powerful economies like the United States and China, and then regional blocs such as the European Union, very much trying to find their way forward and what's going to work. I think that's where we are. So that geopolitical context naturally having an impact on how we understand and view globalization. Then, if we bring it down to the business level, how business leaders can navigate that change and chart their way forward.
How well are they doing that? Just recently was obviously what's happened in Ukraine, energy prices and inflation. Do they feel unsettled?
Well, it's going to be difficult to give a sort of blanket answer to that, but the people who get it right are the people who are going to be on the balls of their feet and leaning into this. These are the people who have grasped the global situation and who are asking the right questions. The people who have engaged in scenario thinking and analysis and posing questions internally about how well they're set up. If there's any key learning point from COVID, it should be, how well prepared were we for this or not, and what learning can we take from that whole episode, that whole period of disruption, and how can we try to mitigate the risk of the unknown going forward?
Well, this is one of the criticisms, of course. If people said that COVID was a black swan event, but it wasn't really.
That's right.
And I think, even what we've seen in Ukraine, was that a black swan event? Well, no, it wasn't really.
Yeah.
And so this critical thinking at this level is something that perhaps we don't actually do very well unless we try.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just thinking about sort of pandemics, Asia has always had these sort of on the doorstep. We've had SARS and other variants here. We don't know how the future is going to unfold. When we were sitting here, or if we'd been sitting here in January of 2020, we had no idea that just around the corner was going to be this world-changing event called COVID. We can't know the future, but we can try to understand it by posing questions and creating scenarios that are going to impact on us, and then thinking how would we respond to that? What type of questions should we be asking ourselves? What steps and measures can we be taking now to infuse within our senior leadership, through our boards and elsewhere, the idea that we need to be responsive, resilient. That word resilience, I think, is something that's come to the fore over the past couple of years as well.
And in the briefing sessions that you've had recently, I know these are the kind of questions that have come up. How can we equip ourselves to be more ready for the future?
Absolutely. And where I find it most rewarding is where I can give a presentation to look at the global outlook. We can look at politics and economics. We can look at some of the underlying trends of the global economy, those big fundamental shifts that are taking place in the global economy. We can look at certain sectors and the application of technology and so on. But the point is, at the end of all of that, you really need to be asking your questions. What does this mean for us?
Yeah.
What is it, us as an organisation? What does it mean for me as a business leader? Having that sight to be able to be looking over the horizon and thinking critically about what it means for the organisation. And not just how would we respond to this, but what are some of the fundamental implications for our business model? Does that need to change in this scenario that we're creating?
In terms of looking forward to 2023, I think we ended the end of last year in a bit of a funk, a pretty gloomy scenario. But, when you start to think about it, perhaps there are things that are settling down. At least we've got known unknowns and known knowns now that we're dealing with.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Towards the end of, the second half, I guess, of 2022, the sort of foot started to come off the accelerator, and we started to hear about layoffs in the tech sector and so on. And projections for 23 were not particularly bright. They're still not. If we look at overall sort of GDP growth for the year as a whole, it will be depressed from 2022. Some places will be doing better. China will be putting in a much better performance this year than it did last year. And actually, just to focus on China, that's one of the reasons to be much more positive about 2023. And I think particularly from the second half of 2023, if we look at things like, the shock of Ukraine, it's no longer a shock. It's a known quantity. It's something that we need to deal with. And places like Europe, for example, are dealing with it. The energy crisis seems to be resolving itself somewhat. Less cold weather in Europe over the winter has helped with all of that, but the worst case scenarios haven't come through. Because of one of the shocks that rippled out from Ukraine was this massive spike in inflation around the world. The US Fed jumped on that very, very quickly and aggressively, hiking its interest rates, which of course led to a strengthening of the US dollar. We've played that through now. All the expectations are, or indicators are, that inflation has peaked, and that sort of hiking process that central banks around the world have been going through will moderate, and then towards later in the year start to plateau and even fall away again. Of course, I mentioned earlier on, China is now opened up, which is simply wasn't on the cards in November of last year. So there have been some fundamental changes, I think, taking place that I think if we come back in the second half of this year, or maybe this time next year, we would have seen a better 2023, particularly from the second half onwards, than we were expecting just a couple of months ago.
Well, that does sound a lot more positive. Let's not leave it another 3 years. Let's make it another 6 months and have another conversation then and see how we're doing in 2023.
Indeed.
Andrew, thank you very much for spending a bit of time with me today.
Thanks,
Thank you.